The idea was from the beginning on to include environmental data and sustainability assessments into decision making because there is ways of quantifying impact. Okay,
you would pay a lot of money to get an LCA done for your company or for your product, right? So, like, I think for them to get it for free from an impact firm, I think it's very interesting.
This tool can be used to get quantitative information on the potential impact of business models or companies or technical solutions. We always use the scientific impact perspective where we calculate or compute the impact per customer, per product, whatever. And then, of course, this then is multiplied with the potential scale of a company, right? So no matter if you have a very large impact for 1 ton of your product, the impact is very small if you do not scale this.
What's the most common misconception about LCA?
That it cannot be done. And that it cannot be included in investment decisions. So I think this is a misconception that many people have.
Hello and welcome to VCO2, the podcast that helps you become a smarter impact investor and better climate tech entrepreneur. Today, we're joined by Dr. Benedikt Buchspies, a scientist who works at Planet A Ventures, one of the best climate tech VC in Germany. Benedikt has spent years at the intersection of science and startup investment, and in this episode, we'll dive into how lifecycle analysis can drive better decisions for impact VCs and the role of science in transforming venture capital. If you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like if you are on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review and a follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Enjoy this episode. Benedikt, thank you so much for coming on the show. And to kick things off and get straight into today's topic, could you explain me how scientists got into venture capital in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. Thanks for having me. For me, this was a kind of coincidence that I ended up in venture capital, to be honest. When I joined Planet A almost 4 years ago, when Planet A was in its very early days, I was working still at the university doing a postdoc researcher position. And I was introduced to one of the founders of Planet A, Fridtjof Detzner. And I just heard that he wants to set up a VC fund. Yeah, that VC fund was supposed to have a very strong sustainability focus, and he wanted to learn more about sustainability assessment. And I worked already for years in that field, did my PhD in the same field, and had, to be honest, no clue what a VC is, literally zero. So the first thing I did is I Googled, what is a VC? That was my first action I did after knowing that I'm going to meet him. So I met him, and I was really intrigued and challenged by the ideas that he had, more in the sense of the technicalities of how to assess many startups, early stage startups, groundbreaking technologies that could help to tackle the most challenging problems we face environmentally. Yeah, I saw this as a big challenge, but I still didn't understand fully what the VC world is about. And then, I started working for Planet A, and it took me quite a while to figure out what this implies and what this means. But so, yeah, I cannot give a general answer to your question, but for me, it was really literally by accident. And I don't regret it a single minute that I met these people and joined Planet A.
No, that's very interesting. I'm curious, what did you think about venture capital when, you started researching, what it means on the internet? Because I'm curious, it might seem like a very weird topic. What are those people doing? They invest money in startups that are not profitable. They don't even have a product. What are they doing?
I didn't think so much about profitability of these startups. It was rather that I was exposed to new technologies and novel ideas at university, right, doing my PhD and postdoc position. So always about some groundbreaking technologies that were developed or evolving. Yeah, I never had any idea about how this whole investment sphere works because, as I said, I was just a scientist working on sustainability assessments of new technologies. But the first thing I noticed, or that I noticed when I started working for VC, is that using environmental impacts or using additional information to guide investment decisions, such as environmental impacts, was not a common practice at all at the time. And for me, this was more of a technical issue. I thought there's technical difficulties and a knowledge gap maybe, but then I figured out after a while this is just not a common practice, and it took a while for this to be implemented. And now we can see this in the whole VC world, not in the whole VC world, but especially green VCs, that put more focus on environmental data to guide investment decisions. And yeah, it took me a while also working for Planet A to figure out that this was groundbreaking to bake this into the DNA of a fund. And that was the most striking to me.
Yeah, I think you were probably one of the first scientists in at least in Europe in climate tech VC. I mean, it's funny because when I talk with people about climate tech VC, and with a lot of people in France and Germany and Europe in general, like your name, or at least Planet A, comes back a lot of the times because you were the first doing that and
Mhm.
having scientists as part of the team, which leads to the topic of today.
Mhm.
And I think for me, I think what's interesting is like it would be to first maybe define what impact assessment mean in venture capital, and maybe also what it means to be like an LCA manager. Like, is that the term I should use? So maybe we start there.
Okay, starting with the first question, that's a very good question, but also a very hard one to answer because I think there's different angles you could have on impact, right? So we have a very specific angle looking at certain topics. We can discuss this in a second. I think other funds have different approaches how to assess impact and also how to see impact, right? So you could assess the impact on climate change of a certain investment. You can assess social impacts. You can look into the intentionality of different solutions or the founders, how on the business models, or you could look into the absolute numbers on what's the potential impact if the company scales. So there's different angles to this. So I wouldn't say there's a golden way to do this. I think we chose a particular one, which we think is a good thing to do. But of course, there are other solutions as well out there, which are probably also very valid approaches also to approach impact and see it differently.
And
And
what way did you choose then?
in what way did we choose this? Because the idea was from the beginning on to include environmental data and sustainability assessments into decision making, because there is ways of quantifying impact. Okay, so we can talk. This is lifecycle assessment, what we're doing, and this tool can be used to get quantitative information on the potential impact of business models or companies or technical solutions. We thought this is a great idea if such techniques and technologies exist to do that, to use that to guide investment decisions, because on the financial side you have qualitative information that you can use, and why not using also qualitative information in terms of environmental impact? And this goes beyond climate change, right? I mean, climate change is obviously a thing that everybody talks about, and it's good that it's done so, but yeah, there are other problems that should also be addressed, and there's also ways to quantify impacts in other impacts. So yeah.
That makes sense. But just to confirm, like when you say have it as a tool to guide the decision, we're
Mhm.
really talking about an investment decision here, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So that's very interesting because it means that you guys actually take other factors that other VCs don't really take into account. But maybe that gets us to like what life cycle analysis means as a tool, how it works. Maybe you can cover a bit of that.
Okay, yeah, sure. So maybe broadly speaking, this is a tool to quantify environmental impacts mainly. So this is the general description of it. And it's most commonly used in companies so far to identify environmental hotspots, for instance, along the supply chain, or to identify different impacts of changing, I don't know, production modalities, production processes, or yeah, identifying hotspots and seeing where the biggest environmental impact is caused within either my company or in the supply chain. It's also extensively used as a tool for certification. So this is commonly used, for instance, in legislation such as the Renewable Energy Directive, where this is used to certify fuel types. So this is a very common approach to be used in these occasions. These type of approaches use usually data gathered from the companies themselves and within the supply chain. So they usually cover everything from raw material extraction to the end of life of a product. So the whole life cycle, as it's included in the name. So this is one part of life cycle assessment and the most common part. And we put an additional, let's say, view on this. So what we would like to understand is what happens if a company scales. So this usually the systemic impacts goes beyond what just happens within the supply chain of a company, but these startups that are scaling at the moment, they could have a larger systemic impact, which to my experience is sometimes even larger than whatever happens within their supply chain. So getting a full picture of the systemic impact of a startup company, yeah, is the main thing that we're interested in. And we can use life cycle assessment to determine any type of environmental impact. For instance, climate change, I mentioned, talked about this, biodiversity, different other environmental impacts such as acidification, eutrophication, so nutrients or any other pollutants emitted to the environment and the harm they could potentially do. That's usually the idea of life cycle assessment.
Okay, so I get it, but so what's the outcome of it? Do you get like a number that says, for example, if this company scales, it will produce 10,000 tons of CO2? Is that the logic of it?
Exactly. Yeah. So you can get this number. So you can see, okay, what is the potential emissions or climate change impact of the company itself, for instance. And then you can also look additionally into what is a systemic change that the company could bring. And then you could compare these numbers or throw them together and see, okay, what is systemically the net impact of the company when it scales? So that's, and then you have a quantitative approach, and yes, you end up with numbers, and you can then of course also compare across different investment opportunities, right? I mean, using the same indicator, you can compare climate change impact of certain investment opportunities or impact on biodiversity, water use, or different other environmental categories.
That's very interesting, and I guess it covers all of the scopes, right? Like scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and it's like the entire thing that we take together, not like at a point in time, but rather throughout the life of this product or company, right?
Exactly. So what we're usually looking at is we are taking a look at what the company is doing at the moment, but this is not very indicative, I would say, or very expressive of what might happen if the company scales, because we are investing early stage, seed, pre-seed, and Series A. So oftentimes these companies have prototypes or small pilot plans running, and so the technicalities and different parameters in these smaller factories or lab experiments, of course, might differ from what happens once the company scales to a much larger scale. So we are mainly focusing on the state when the company scaled into a larger scale, because this is, of course, when the company will create impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I'm curious though is like, so it's an early stage company. They don't have a lot of people, they don't have a lot of resources, they don't have a lot of histories, they don't have a lot of data. Like, how do you run an LCA on top of that context, right? Because like I could imagine it's easy for like a big company that has years of history, that has thousands of people working for them, but like for a small startup, like where do you get the data? Or do you work with them to produce it?
So I think there's pros and cons of being a small company, to be honest, because I think it's sometimes even harder for a big corporate, because they have global supply chains, they have many hierarchical structures, so it's really hard to get information. Whereas if I'm dealing with founders, then I talk to them about the data needs that I would have to doing the LCA, and then discuss with them how they could gather this. And most of the times they have the data at hand, because the most crucial data, I would say, or the most important data to be used, is most often contained in their internal techno-economical assessments they would use internally, also to project costs of their production methods, for instance. So most of the data is readily available, what happens within the company. Sometimes it's not, but most of the times, to my experience, after doing this for 4 years now with startups, we had very few cases where there was a complete lack of data and the companies just didn't know. And then, even if that's the case, so then we try to figure out if there's ways of at least getting some basic understanding of this, either by using scientific literature. So if you find comparable technologies in scientific literature, you could see, okay, this is comparable. And what we would then do is, because there's high uncertainty, of course, involved in this, what we then do is use different techniques to deal with uncertainty, to deal with these uncertainties. So we use either, for instance, scenario assessments. So we would define different scenarios. So let's say if the technology develops as projected linearly, let's say, or if there's a much better performance increase, or let's say a bit less optimal performance increase. So we define it, let's say, different trajectories how this could evolve. So technically, for instance, and then we set up these LCA models with parameters, so we could run different scenarios, and then we see more or less a trajectory how this could evolve. And then if still, let's say, in the best and worst case, the startup ends up in a positive impact, like in a significant positive impact. We don't know where this ends up, right, at some point, but still we are very confident that it's somewhere within this trajectory, but we would consider this as a positive impact, a significant impact that we would invest in. So no matter how this evolves, as long as it evolves somewhere in this trajectory, we are confident this produces a positive impact. That's one part for the startup. Equally hard part, or even harder part, I would say, is understanding the systemic implications of a startup, right? Because the startup scales, so they use certain materials in the market, they might produce certain products. This affects consumers out there. Different companies use different materials, affecting waste streams, lots and lots of different changes. And of course, these changes are also, uncertain. We wouldn't know what happens. I mean, we don't have the crystal ball to see the future, right? So again, we would use scenarios in this case to model different potential outcomes, maybe best and worst case scenarios as well, to see how this systemically could happen. And then third and last, I would say, there's other techniques such as Monte Carlo simulation, where we just define parameters within your model, and they would say, okay, let's say the efficiency of your electrolyzer is between X and Y, but we don't know where it is. It's just somewhere in between, and you define a function how this would look like in between, and then you can define, I don't know, hundreds of parameters in your model, or dozens, and then you can compute your model for 1,000, 10,000 times, and then you would come up with a distribution of potential outcomes. And then you still wouldn't know where the future lies, but still it gives you some confidence if the whole, let's say, if it's a bell curve or whatever comes out this shape results in a significant positive impact, you would still have confidence that there's a positive impact happening.
That makes sense. And I'm curious, like, how much is that correlated with like the financial performance, like sales performance of the company? Because I mean, as a like aspiring VC, I know how hard it is already to forecast, financials and sales performance and the future for startups. Like, how much is it correlated with the LCA in your case?
It's so there's different aspects to this. So it is very much correlated. So because what we also do internally is we always use the scientific impact perspective, where we calculate or compute the impact per customer, per product, whatever. And then, of course, this then is multiplied with the potential scale of a company, right? So no matter if you have a very large impact for 1 ton of your product, the impact is very small if you do not scale this. And so it's always this overlap here. So there's this direct correlation there. That's the most obvious one. What we also look at is if the company scales into different markets, is this aligned with impact? Because I mentioned there's systemic impact of companies. So it might happen that companies start scaling into markets because it's economically the most profitable way or the easiest way to scale. And then we'll see, okay, how does it align with impact? If you scale into this market, what could be your impact? And if you scale into another market because other materials are used in this market, other products exist, what is the potential impact in these markets? Yeah, of course, there's huge difference, right? I mean, thinking about the energy system, for instance, in some European countries, there's more coal power used than in others. In others, there's still a lot of nuclear being used. So if you affect the energy system, of course, there's different impacts as well. If you affect, let's say, if you scale into France, where there's a lot of nuclear power being used, whereas if you scale into other countries where there's less nuclear and maybe also higher quantities of fossil fuels being used. So yeah, that's the second aspect, I would say, checking if the company scales into different markets, is it aligned with the impact as well? So that's maybe the second most important aspect we pay attention to.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. And I guess my question now would be to say, what outcome are you trying to get to? Because we understand now that it's very uncertain. Like everything that you model out has a percentage of probability which is probably very low, but you want to have it in a certain range so that you trust it, right? The question for you, I guess, is like, what outcome are you looking at? Are you saying I want to have, let's say, a certain number of like million tons of CO2 reduction, or are you more looking at it from the angle of like, I just want it to be net positive for the planet, and if yes, that's enough. Like, where do you stand in that choice?
Yeah. So we decided not to use a absolute threshold for all investment opportunities. And the reason why we did this is we look at systemic impacts of different companies. And obviously then we also look at different magnitudes of systemic impact, right? Some companies affect the whole energy system of a country, whereas other companies might have a smaller systemic impact on a smaller scale. And they might be equally important for the transition to combat climate change. So that's why we always try to also see here a bit, okay, what is the systemic impact we assessed? Because that goes way beyond the company, right? We have a company that does or provides a certain technology, and then this is part of a larger change that happens. And if the larger change is revolutionizing the whole energy system or heat supply in residential heat supply, let's say, obviously there's a huge impact. But the contribution of the startup is important, necessary, and essential, but still it's a small contribution. Mm-hmm. Whereas other companies might be the main driver. Let's say if you supply a very sustainable packaging material and you are the one that provides a solution that is cost competitive and much more sustainable, the overall impact is still like very, very valuable, but still it's from in absolute numbers smaller than the other company that affects the whole larger system. So that's why we do not use absolute numbers. What we still do is, after working such a long time on these topics, we have seen many solutions in many sectors and spaces. So we continuously trying to raise the bar. So we were trying to push it and increase the impact among the same group of solutions in space.
That makes sense. So you're really looking at what is the best solution that I can get as opposed to an absolute number. Is that correct?
Yes. So we use absolute numbers. We get to the absolute numbers. That's why we use LCAs. Yeah. But again, we wouldn't put a threshold, an absolute number that each startup needs to achieve, because I think we look at different levels of systemic impact and different contributions to that. It also goes beyond just a quantitative number, right? Because we also use then, we assess the system itself and see, okay, what are the crucial barriers that need to be overcome there? What is the systemic impact that could happen beyond just savings in greenhouse gas emissions or reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or impact on biodiversity, let's say. But we would see, okay, there are crucial market barriers in certain systems here, and they need to be overcome to trigger the transition we would like to see. And this could be beyond just looking at pure numbers.
That's very interesting. And I think that leads to the next section of this episode, because as you know, this podcast is about venture capital and climate tech. And I mean, obviously you're a scientist at a venture capital firm, so that's very interesting. At Planet A, you've fully integrated the LCA as part of the decision making. To react on what you were just saying before, you sometimes look at places and markets where like you have needs for certain technology to unlock the wider picture. How much of a role do you play in guiding the investment thesis of the fund, for example?
I would say very much so. So it's deeply ingrained into Planet A's DNA, as I mentioned earlier. So impact assessments is always part of the investment process itself. So fully ingrained from the start to the end. So of course we build internal hypotheses on potential impacts in different sectors. So we have ideas on what are the most sustainable solutions, let's say, in the packaging space or in the residential heating space. I mentioned these two sectors already. Yeah, so we build hypotheses on what are the most promising solutions impact-wise. And then, of course, the investors in our teams would also look at these spaces and think, okay, these are the most economically promising solutions there. And then we see where the overlap is. And then, of course, we have a good fishing net to cast to find the most promising fishes out there. That's one. Second is we are very involved quite early in the process. So once the investors discover the startup or the startup approaches us, we would take a first look at these companies, and then we would immediately start looking into the sustainability of these companies. So obviously we have worked on this for quite some time now. So we have seen many solutions in the space, and it's, let's say, it happens rarely that we see solutions that we haven't seen at all, or the systemic impact happens that we have not encountered yet. This happens. I'm not denying this, but most of the times companies scale into markets that we have assessed before, right? I mean, we have assessed the packaging market, for instance, and then different solutions might differ in how companies do things. But systemically, we know what happens if a company scales and produces an alternative in this market, right? So from this experience, of course, we do these assessments and see, okay, this is a promising solution. And then we would engage with the founders to gather the data, do the LCA calculations, and then we would have the LCA numbers ready before an investment decision. So this is taken into the investment decision, and the whole company itself would only be moved to an investment committee meeting if we are convinced that there's potential positive impact. And otherwise, we wouldn't even move it to an investment committee meeting.
That's super interesting. And how much of a burden is it on funders to provide you with their data? Like, how long does it take them? Because, one thing I think VCs are very careful with is to not put too much pressure on funders, because they also need to be building a business on top of like raising money, right? Like, how much of a burden is that for them?
That depends a bit on the knowledge they have already on their processes. But as I said before, usually they have quite a solid understanding of what they're doing. So I think it is some additional burden. And we had also challenging discussions, right? Because if we look at systemic impacts of companies, we might have a certain view, or we develop a certain view, which might differ from what the startup has. And then we challenge our view as well, right? It's not that we are saying we have the answer to everything. It's we have a hypothesis, and then it's us to discuss with the founders and see, okay, do we have to reshape our opinion on certain sectors? Or oftentimes, but it happens as well that the founders see our view and then, I haven't thought about this. Okay, yeah, the systemic view that you see here, I haven't thought about this before, also from a sustainability angle. So it also enriches their work as well, no matter if we invest or not. So this happens as well. So it's a mutual beneficial process, I would say. Yes, it is more work, I guess, for them. But overall, and that's maybe the biggest advantage of this is, I mean, doing these lifecycle assessments for them or understanding the impact of these companies is not just helping us, assisting us in finding more sustainable solutions, but once we invested, we publish these LCAs on our website. And this is to create transparency. We want to be transparent in our decision making. That's why we publish it, and also want the ecosystem to evolve and also want to learn to others. That's why we think transparency is key here. And then our portfolio companies could use these LCAs themselves to show the positive impact they have. Okay, So, and I think this is an advantage they could have compared to competitors, because then they can demonstrate, if they're dealing with procurement departments and people that have a sustainability target there internally, demonstrate, okay, this is our contribution to sustainability in your company if you use our solution, or in fundraising and so on. So these benefits is something that we can bring with these LCAs, and having this knowledge and having this deep understanding, I think is a very great value add to these companies. Yeah, so it's an additional effort, but I think the additional value they gain from this is also undeniable.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, like the way I think about it is like it's almost free consulting for them, because like you would pay a lot of money to get an LCA done for your company or for your product, right? So like I think for them to get it for free from an impact firm, I think it's very interesting. You said it's fully integrated as part of the investment process, and a company doesn't get into an investment committee if you don't have an LCA ready that is showing a positive impact. How long does it take you to run an LCA on a company? Because I would assume that you don't want to delay the entire process just because of that, right?
So the effort differs, the amount of time spent on each LCA, and I think this depends mostly on the complexity of the systemic impact. So of course, if the company has a complex technology that we assess, it takes more time, but in general, it takes much more time. If the systemic impact is global in different markets and the markets differ, then it takes a while, several days to several weeks. Okay. What we usually do is, when we have these numbers ready, so we have these numbers for an IC. We have never had delays in the IC because of the impact assessment. So we are 3 people in the team, and if needed, we are all hands on deck and work on this collectively. So we would have, let's say, at least a rough LCA ready for this investment committee meeting. And then we would still have, if there's open questions left or different scenarios that we would like additionally to check, we would do this in the DD. And then, of course, we would have a preliminary investment decision, but would say, okay, these are things that we need to check in the DD. And then we would run the rest of the calculations. And usually this is done in parallel to other DD work. It is additional work, but we have never had the feeling that this delayed our processes at all.
Well, which is great. I think it's great that you've been able to actually incorporate it as part of the entire process, and I think that's very interesting. I don't think many funds do it like that. One question I have for you though is like, do you know why Planet A decided to do it internally as opposed to hire a third party for every deal, or like build us, like buy a software, for example, to do it? Like, do you know why they chose that way?
I don't know why the decision was made originally, but since I have been part of this since the very early days and we developed this internally, we tried different things ourselves, from developing software to externalizing part of the work as well. So this was all, we were discussing this obviously because, of course, how can we scale also our impact approach, and can we externalize things? And the reason why we keep as much as possible internally at the moment is this work with the founders, discussing systemic impact, for instance, like having the systemic view on companies, is not just needed for our impact approach, but it also brings another perspective to the investment approach. So if, let's say, thinking of a company that uses any waste stream to produce whatever material, or a substitute for conventional plastics, for cement, for, I don't know, or waste-based approach to extract proteins. There are different solutions out there that use waste streams. And for impact, what we assess is, okay, was the potential impact of using this material because somebody else uses it at the moment, right? In this effort of understanding, okay, where do they source the feedstock, we would assess what are the quantities there, what are other solutions in the market that could potentially scale and also need this material. And suddenly, looking at the systemic view on impact, you would also discover, okay, they might run into a shortage of material they could potentially use, or this affects the price, because at the moment, the material might be almost for free or even for free if they dispose of waste. But if there are suddenly different solutions scaling that would need this material or would want to use this material, the thing changes, right? And that's, of course, things most founders have in their minds, but of course, having such a systemic view on these solutions also benefits very much our investment hypothesis, or looking at different sectors. So long story short, these type of findings that we create doing our work is very much beneficial to the investment process itself. And having the close relation to the founders allows us to be very, very fast. So because, as I said, I mean, sometimes there's crunch time. We need to work full force on LCAs and impact assessments. And also when we support the founders later on, once we invested, we have this knowledge in-house. So they can always contact us, can always chat with us. We do updates for these LCAs for the founders themselves to have an updated version for fundraising or getting customers. And third, also for us to track the impact, to see, okay, are they still aligned with the impact that we assessed initially when we invested into the company? So having this in-house is I think, a very efficient way in dealing with all these requirements and also value adds that we deliver. That's why we have decided yet not to externalize this.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting how, the financial view and sales view communicates with the LCA because, like, for example, as you said, like, what if there's a shortage of this material and then the price skyrocket for it, and then obviously then the business case for the company doesn't really make sense anymore because the economic doesn't make sense anymore, right? Like, I love how like that there's a correlation between these two topics. I'm curious though, like, do you ever run into challenges or like uh, conflicts with the investors because they see a very profitable company that could have a positive impact, but let's say, for example, this is not enough as per the LCA. Their impact is good but not enough to make a case for it. Like, do you ever have a conflict between like the LCA team and the investment team?
No, not at all. So there would never be conflict at all, because I think everyone that joined Planet A knows what we are working for and what we want to do, and this is part of our approach. So of course we have discussions, but not in the sense of, okay, they are criticizing our internal impact work to an extent that they think, okay, we have a great economic case here, but you're destroying our big party here because you're just always bringing up the impact is not big enough. This never ever happened. I mean, I have this solid understanding that there will be profitable companies and sustainable companies, and they could be the same. So, and we are very confident that in many cases these sustainable companies are also the most profitable companies in the future, right? And so that's our strong hypothesis. So that's why we have this huge overlap. So there was never a conflict within the team, because this is very much ingrained into this. And as I said, I mean, they feel oftentimes that our work enriches their work as well, and also their work enriches mine, because if I need to understand the market better, I would also consult with them, and we could develop common understanding of the potential market. So it's a very collaborative approach, and it's not one part, like the impact part works against the investment part. So it's always a collaborative approach, and also within the investment decision, it's clear that we would like to see promising startup in terms of performance, but also impact. That's just otherwise, as I said, we wouldn't move it to an IC. Yeah, so we never had this, to be honest. If that was the case, I wouldn't want to work for Planet A, to be honest. I mean, that's my personal opinion. So because I think assessing impact is good as a measure to do this, and I think it's nice if this guides investment decision. And of course, it's good if people criticize the work and question it. I think that's important to improve as well. I think it's not the holy script that we print out there as an impact team, and this is the way it is. I think it is a document to be discussed, and that's why I think it's always a good thing also if people question this and criticize it.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting there is like there's a collective mindset within the team that it makes sense to have an LCA, and therefore like everybody agrees on it. And the second thing that I find very interesting there is like, anyway, if a company doesn't scale, the impact will be very limited. So like there is definitely like a correlation, right? Like you need a company to scale to be able to have a great impact, because as you said earlier, like, yeah, they might have a very positive impact for 1 ton of the product, but if you're today selling 1 kilogram, then obviously like the impact is very limited, right? And so as the profit and the financials. Well, let's get into another section, and I guess there I just really want to pick your brain a little bit on what are the pros and cons of having an LCA. And I'll force you to give some cons. I'm sure like you will find some of them, but like, what are they for you?
Okay, starting with the pros. So I mentioned a few of them already. So I think it's a good tool or the best tool available to have a quantitative approach to assess impact and use this to guide investment decisions. I think that's the biggest advantage of that. And the second is obviously, apart from guiding the investment decision, is supporting our portfolio companies. I think that's the second most important ones, because they are the ones driving change, right? We are supporting them. So I think that's it helps them to do this on their mission. These are the most striking pros, I would say. And also having the possibility overall systemically to quantify impact and having a whole scientific community working on this methodology and different methods to improve it is a great thing to have, right? Because then suddenly it's not just financials that could matter, but you could really take other things into account, such as environmental impact. And I think that's the biggest advantage you could have, because we're facing climate change, biodiversity loss, to name just the two biggest problems we're facing at the moment environmentally. So yeah, it's a great tool to drive more sustainable decisions in the investment space. And of course, this will obviously shape the future economy that we will see, or is most likely to shape, right? I mean, these are the future companies that will hopefully change the way the economy works, or at least how sustainability evolves.
Yeah. And just to go sideways very briefly, but like, how do you stay optimistic while being in so much of the details of what's happening in the world, right?
That's a hard one. That was so far the hardest question from your side, I have to say. So it's really hard for me, to be honest. It is. It's not easy because reading how slow progress is, and also thinking of how long things take, right? I mean, we need a transition, and it goes beyond just finding new solutions technically, right? I mean, we're dealing as a VC investing into tech, dealing a lot with technologies, and I think technology is a key component of what needs to change, or what can bring changes for the better. But there's the second component, let's say society and policy as a third one. Let's say these are huge other spheres that need to adapt as well. We need so much change on so many fronts at the moment. Seeing what happened now politically in the US, for instance, or also how the shift in Europe goes now towards the right. I'm skeptical, let's say, at least. Yeah, it's not that I'm depressed by that. So it's I mean, we have to work on a solution, and I really enjoy what I'm doing. So that's I think it's very privileged that I have. So this I think motivates me to work on this, and dealing with interesting founders and great ideas. I think this is also what motivates me, right? I mean, talking to people, understanding new technologies, and really talking to people that really have the idea of changing the world. And I think that's something that is motivating. I'm not sure if we make it, but I think it's worth trying at least.
No, for sure. That's very interesting. And so what are some drawbacks of using LCA in your investment decisions?
So drawbacks in general, I would say, requires effort and time. It's hard to implement. I think we tackled this problem internally, but I think this is a barrier in general because it's a complex methodology and people need to understand what this is about. I think that's why it's hard to implement for funds in general to use this methodology. And I think that's one of the major drawbacks. And then if you look at the systemic impact that I mentioned already a few times, there's high uncertainty reality involved here, right? I mean, but this uncertainty we have to deal with. In my opinion, this shouldn't be an argument not to look at things because everything is uncertain out there. Also, the financial projections are uncertain, right? I can have a business model now. I have no idea if the company will evolve like this in the future because things change. And there's also uncertainty related here. So uncertainty is one, but I think that's not a major drawback. It's just people have to understand uncertainty and work with it and also use the right interpretation of the numbers they have in light of the uncertainty. So, but this is, I think, also a con that sometimes these numbers are considered as the solid truth. And I think this is not the case. I mean, these numbers are numbers created within a certain range of possibilities and scenarios, and there's uncertainty involved. And I think that's the most important thing to pay attention here too. Yeah, I think these are the two major drawbacks. Or the third one maybe is there's environmental problems, some of which we can easily measure or assess. Climate change, for instance. There are others which are much harder to assess, biodiversity. But there's many others. Looking at the planetary boundaries, we are transgressing 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries at the moment. So there's definitely other topics that are also relevant. Assessing those and also creating awareness of those it's still in its early days, I would say. I mean, people have been working on this for years. Everybody talks about climate change, but it took us decades to reach this point, right? And still we are making progress, but slow progress. On biodiversity or any other environmental impacts, we are very slow in implementing this into people's mindsets. And so this is one thing that needs to happen, in my opinion. Yes, and also, of course, these LCA methods allow assessment of certain impacts, and others that cannot be assessed with these methodologies. You might oversee them or overlook them if you only use one certain methodology. So I think that's a con in that sense because the methodology is limited to a certain angle.
That makes sense. One thing I'd be curious if you can very briefly mention is like, what is the playbook to implement it? Because you mentioned that it's one of the drawback is to implement it and make sure it's really part of the fund. What's your playbook? Like, what are the 5 steps that I should take tomorrow if I want to do the same in my investment firm?
Okay, first one, most important one, be honest about it. I mean, do it if you really mean it. I think that's the key requirement, I would say, because if those people that started Planet A some years ago didn't have this on their minds, I think this wouldn't be ingrained so deeply, right? I mean, you have to make this this conscious decision that you would like to include impact as a parameter in your investment decision, right? And then you would not have these conflicts between impact and economy. But if you have the thesis that this goes along together, hand in hand, then you should do it. If not, you can do it, but I think then it's a harder process to create this type of setup. Second, I would say, hire people that know how to do this. I think that's an important one, because it is complicated to do these LCAs, and it involves a lot of understanding of the methodology itself, on technologies that need to be assessed. And if you look at systemic impacts, also the systemic impacts, and obviously if you have done this for some time, you are faster in doing that, and you know the right questions to ask founders, right? And this also eases the pain or the additional work for founders, because if you already know what data you would require, it's much faster, because you can just gather the data, you just ask them precise questions. So this is much faster than if you start from scratch and you have basically very small understanding of the whole system and what you would need to look at. So I think finding the right people, competent people, I think this is the second most important part, and then just give it a go. I think anyone should shy away from this, because it's worth trying, I'd say.
For sure. Very interesting. Well, look, we're getting toward the end of this episode, but one last section that we have in this podcast is called the fire questions. So those are questions that I will throw at you, and you'll have like 1 or 2 sentences to answer them maximum. So we'll try to cover quite a few of them in the next 5 minutes. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
Great. What is the most surprising finding that you've come across using an LCA?
The most surprising one is, as I said earlier, so that the systemic impacts of companies could deviate from what the company does itself. So if you really look into what happens if the company scales, you might discover effects that you would not see if you only look at what the supply chain of a company.
Super interesting. Do you think an LCA can predict the future success of a startup?
Yes, depends a bit on the product. But for many products, or for companies working on business models and solutions that are dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, carbon credits, and so on, then there's a direct overlap between whatever you emit and the credits you can sell, for instance. I mean, this is for all carbon capture facilities, that's the case. So there's a direct correlation. And in many other sectors, we see a trend towards more sustainability. And of course, then if you have the more sustainable products, it's an indication that you might be more successful in the future.
I love that. What's the most common misconception about LCA?
That it cannot be done. And that it cannot be included in investment decisions. So I think this is a misconception that many people have.
I love that. Do you think impact measurement will be mandatory for VCs in the future?
It is to some extent already with SFDR and taxonomy, right?
Yeah.
We have to do that. In my personal opinion, this should be mandatory for every investment, because now at the moment, we as Green VC Article 9 fund, we need to demonstrate the sustainability of a product or a startup or investment. And I don't understand why, in general, assessing the implications of investment decision isn't mandatory, because this should be the standard case, because you also do the DD in financial terms. And then you would see, okay, then you have this number at hand, and then everybody can make a decision. And if you just put this as a burden on those ones that strive for sustainability, it's an additional systemic disadvantage you give to them, right? And I don't see why this should happen.
Makes sense. What would you say to an impact VC that think that impact assessment, specifically at the early stages, is a waste of time?
It's a valid opinion. I mean, as I said, I mean, people have different approaches to do things. We see the value in doing it early, as I said. So I mentioned already a few positive aspects of it. We support our portfolio companies. We have a solid understanding of the market and how it scales and the potential implications. So there's huge overlaps for our investment hypothesis. I only mostly see advantages. So I would just say, yeah, it's your choice, but not mine.
Interesting. What's the most exciting innovation you've been confronted with at the firm?
We've seen some moonshots. I don't want to point out a specific company or mention a few specific companies, but at the moment we see a lot of interesting things, let's say, in space tech, where people really try to collect energy in outer space. This I find interesting. I'm not saying this is going to work or anything. I mean, I'm just saying that I find this this is something I haven't seen much before in the previous years. Yeah, this is like technologically an interesting part. And overall, I would say in many sectors you can have groundbreaking innovations. 2
last questions for you today, and then we'll be over. What's one piece of advice for a founder entering the climate tech space right now?
I think this differs a bit in the sectors they're working in, but I think many founders are on the right mission. They know what to do, and I think it's for politicians, the path is clear. For society, it is mainly. So stay on track.
I love that. And what are the 3 most important thing to be a successful impact VC? And I consider you as an impact VC. I know you're not in the investment team, but you're clearly part of the process there.
So the 3 most important aspects to become a successful one?
Yeah.
Invest in the right companies. That's the most important one, because that's obviously the intention of a VC, right? Is to find the most promising and profitable startups in the future. And again, I think we have the strong hypothesis that we can find the most profitable and more sustainable startups, and there's an overlap here. So I think that's number one. Number two is align everything to this target. That's obviously the target. And number three is be open to question your views and ideas. I think then you constantly evolving and improving your ways of acting.
Great. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Benedikt, for today. I'll recap quickly what we've learned today. So, roughly speaking, we've learned that LCA is an assessment of a startup or a product from end to end, from different perspectives, biodiversity being one, climate being another, social being another. Like there are multiple layers to an LCA. We've learned how it can be used in an investment decision as part of the investment process, both before the investment committee and during due diligence as well, which I think is very interesting. And yeah, we've learned quite a few things from you today. So what is, maybe just to end on a positive note, like what is one word or like one optimism sentence that you would have for people like working in this ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of improvement happening, so we can see more and more engagement of different actors to improve also methodologies used in this space, and I really appreciate this is happening. So this consolidation of approaches, and as people are really intentionally moving the space forward, and I think that's the most positive thing to see. And I hope that this persists in the future.
If people want to reach out, where can they find you online?
On LinkedIn, I would say that's the easiest, and then that's the easiest
I'll
way
put
how
the
to
link
reach
to
it.
your LinkedIn in the description.
Thank you.
And one last question for you: who's the next climate VC or scientist that works in a VC firm that I should interview?
I don't have any specific person in mind. I think I don't know. I have to think about this and see, come up with.
Sounds good. Well, you can let me know after this
Yeah.
episode. And to anyone listening, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, comment, give us a 5-star review, and share the love for this topic of venture capital and sustainability. Thank you so much, Benedikt.
Yeah, thank you, Hugo, for having me.